So welcome everybody on this brisk sunny day to the fourth iteration of the Planet Texas Research Showcase. Today we're having a series led by two teams that look at the deep past, both in Texas and across the world, as a way to help us probe questions about resilience, living together, both now in the present and into the future. And I'll turn it over to Adam to start.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for attending. I am going to see if I can replicate what I just did successfully. Okay, can everybody see this? Great. So we're going to present a very brief overview of what we've done primarily in the second year of a two-year project called Resources, Stress, and Population Dynamics in Pre-Modern Urban Societies. And we wanted to focus on a sort of a central unifying theme in this presentation. So we're presenting not everything that we've done, but some things that hang together we feel pretty well. And that the theme that has run through all of these projects, so to speak, is the importance of water, and the importance of water, especially in urban societies and conglomerations of settlement. And we've been looking at this from two perspectives, one from the perspective of water management, and the other from the perspective of what water tells us about the way that people move around the landscape. And we'll get more into this in a moment. I wanted to just begin by saying that this has been a massive collective effort over these last 2 years with lots of people and groups who have been involved. And if we seem to be a bit scattered geographically and temporally, this is by design so that we could compare very different environments, but we have stuck quite closely to issues related to cities in various periods and to issues related to water and population mobility in those cities, especially at times of climate stress. And a couple of those times that we'll be talking about are the centuries surrounding what's sometimes referred to as the Maya collapse, although this is probably a bad way to talk about it, and the centuries after the Roman climate optimum, which ended around the 2nd or 3rd century AD, and which led to what we usually talk about as the fall of the Roman Empire, but probably shouldn't talk about in that way either. So we know from experience that it's difficult to manage water in urban environments and to stay on top of it, because sometimes you have too little, as we saw with the narrowly avoided 0 day in Cape Town, South Africa, a couple of years ago, when the city almost entirely ran out of water, and you see people filling water bottles to make sure that they can carry out daily functions and stay alive in Cape Town. And sometimes you have too much water, which causes you to have too little water, as those of you who lived in Austin 2 years ago might remember, when a series of floods and sediment washed down from the hill country and stopped the functioning of the Austin water processing plants. So we all had to boil water in a major 21st century urban agglomeration for about 10 days. So the projects that you'll hear about today are scattered across the world in places where the interaction between water, human beings, and urbanism has been particularly interesting in light of climate factors and population mobility. So we will look at the edge of the Greek and Roman world on the coast of the Black Sea. We'll look at Rome itself and its water supply coming from the Lago di Bracciano, a particular aqueduct. We'll look at the region of Belize and Guatemala, where the center of the Mayan culture was. And we will look at San Antonio, which has a fairly precocious engagement as an urban center with water, which we'll hear about from Michael Holleran. So we'll be handing off and we'll all try to keep our presentations quite short in an effort to preserve 5 minutes or so for questions at the end. So if we run through it a little bit, please forgive us. We do this for your sake, audience. So we'll start with the furthest point away from Austin, the edge of the Roman and Greek world, at the mouth of the Danube as it empties into the Black Sea. And this is the site of Histria, which was a Greek colonial settlement founded by the city of Miletus in the 7th century BC. And then an important center up until about the 1st century BC, when one of many episodes of destruction set it back significantly. And after that, it was a minor Roman provincial town until about the 7th century AD, when shifting demographics and climate factors caused it to be abandoned. This is the project that I've been leading in the field. I'm going to talk briefly about the context, and then I'm going to turn things over to Angie Locker, who will talk about why water is important for understanding human movement in this environment. So I'm zooming us in. You can see the mouth of the Danube, that large area of green at the top of the screen. This is the progression of the Danube Delta as sediment is deposited, and the sediment that comes from the Danube changes the coastal dynamics quite remarkably. The city that I'm going to show you was originally a port city on the Black Sea itself, and is now behind about 5 miles of coastal lagoon closed by sandbars. So it has no contact with the sea at all anymore. The initial settlement took place in the area to the right of the screen, where you see the most remains. That is sort of the acropolis of this city. And it would have been originally a peninsula, or maybe even an island just off the coast, which is what Greeks liked to settle on because they were easily defensible. And water was an issue from the beginning, both because it dictated where the site was located. They settled in a place where they had access to the mouth of the Danube, and because settling on the coast of the Black Sea on an outcrop of green schist like this, pretty close to sea level, meant that the provision of fresh water was going to be a challenge over time. And this is one of the things that our project would like to explore. But I'm going to focus instead not on the early Greek period and on these problems of water management, but on the Roman period and on what happens on the lower part of the city. In between these two would have been the harbor. That part of the city was occupied with residences and industrial areas, especially focused on ceramic production in the Greek period, but it was destroyed in a sack of the city in the 1st century BC. And when the city was reoccupied in the 1st century AD and sort of refounded by the Romans, it contracted. It no longer had the same population, and that area became a massive cemetery for the Roman period population, in use from about the 2nd century AD to about the 6th century AD, which, if you were paying close attention when I was discussing the climate factors earlier, marks the end of the Roman climate optimum and a period of more chaotic environmental factors, major population migrations, incursions, coexistence, and conflict between different social groups. So we were interested in looking at that cemetery and the human population as it underwent demographic changes and suffered various stresses related to both other people and to the changing environment. So the area that we have been looking at is in the center of the plateau. If you can see my cursor, can you see my cursor? Yes. So we have been investigating this area here, where we identified a major anomaly in a magnetometry survey, which turned out to be a pottery kiln from the Hellenistic occupation, the occupation before the 1st century AD. There are burials all over this area, and we were trying to find out if there were some in the middle too, and there were. This is the area that we excavated. You can see the remains of the pottery kiln. That chocolate chip cookie looking feature is the firing floor with vent holes to the firing chamber, the combustion chamber below it. And it was destroyed with the rest of this area probably around the 1st century, mid-1st century BC. And later the area was occupied by Roman period burials. There is a major burial monument that we haven't been able yet to excavate here, probably multiple generations. It seems to have been open and shut several times. And on top of it was an amphora, a wine amphora of the 2nd century AD, and a Roman sword of a type also present, also popular in the 2nd century AD. So we may have one of the earlier burials in a fairly monumental form. And then these red squares also represent later burials, all of children. And these burials, the one radiocarbon date we have suggests that they were from about the, well, somewhere between the 5th and the 6th centuries AD, so quite a bit later. So we've been looking at both human remains from previous excavations in other places on the plateau and some of the remains of those child burials that we identified from both an osteological perspective and an isotopic perspective. And here are some of the results that we obtained in collaboration with the University of Georgia with carbon nitrogen analysis, which tends to tell you something about diet. And in this case, it is also telling us something, we think, about potentially the weaning age of some of these children, because some of the elevated nitrogen values suggest that some of them may still have been nursing, although that's a little complicated. But we've also been looking at isotope values from oxygen and strontium, which get into the body through both drinking water and through your diet and the food chain. And because they're connected to factors in the geological landscape, they can give us information about how people are moving around. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Angie Locker, who has been carrying out that strontium and oxygen isotopic analysis. Angie, just tell me when to advance and I will go ahead. That's the kiln and that monumental tomb.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Okay, so as Adam mentioned, essentially the way that isotopes work are you are basically what you eat in that very cliched saying. So as you are drinking local waters, your body is incorporating the oxygen from those waters and the strontium from those waters. And so we're using waters here as a way to get at who was born where they were buried and who had immigrated from a different place. So the map that you're looking at here are the collection points for 10 different waters that we analyzed oxygen and strontium for. Adam, can you go to the next slide, please? Mm-hmm. So when we compare the delta values from the oxygen with the strontium ratios, there are essentially 3 different zones. You can see zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 that kind of parse out by these different values. The distance between them is pretty vast, so I'm not super confident to say that there's 3 exact zones. I think more sampling is definitely necessary to kind of look at how these ratios kind of play out on that landscape. But with the small sample that we have now, statistically, we're seeing about 3 different zones from those, just from the waters. Can you go to the next one? So this is from those original samples. This is how those zones are kind of playing out. Oh, y'all probably can't see my cursor because I'm not sharing.
Tell me what to highlight.
Can you point to Histria on this map?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Histria is right here.
Histria is there. So I'm calling Histria within zone 3 of the waters. And then you can see in the north and the south, we kind of parse out into zones 1 and 2. Again, zone 1 is in the red, and then zone 2 is represented by the green. So when we kind of compare the water with the 5, we only had 5 individuals that we were able to get strontium and oxygen for. To this point, we have several other burials that we'll be working with throughout the course of the next several months. Can you go to the next slide? When we compare those values, you can see 4 of the 5 individuals fall right within zone 3, which is where Histria kind of falls within. And then there's this one extreme outlier represented in yellow. The waters are the circles, and then the individuals are the triangles. Again, zone 1 is red, zone 2 is green, and zone 3 is blue. And then you have one individual who falls way outside what the local ratios would have been. So that person is an external long distance immigrant. So they're coming from somewhere else outside of the regions that we have actually measured to date. And the crazy thing about this person is they were female, and we call them a subadult, so between the ages of 16 and 20. The sample that we took from this individual was a third molar. Those molars are done mineralizing by the age of 13. So that means that this person moved to the region and died pretty shortly after coming to the area, which, as we kind of go through and look at some of the earlier teeth and formation, might give us a better sense of some of these kind of changes, or looking at the diet and stuff in the bones could give us some other kind of indicators. So that is all I have.
Thank you, Angie.
Yeah.
So we're going to shift now from Histria to the area around Rome to hear about the Aqua Traiana, which is one of the most important aqueducts that fed this city that around the turn of the era had perhaps 1 million people in it.
Thanks, Adam and Angie. I'll be more brief since I don't really have a lot of findings yet, at least with regard to the component of the project that has been funded by PT 2050. But I do want to point out initially that this is a project that's been going on off and on for about the last 10 years. But the project initially was essentially a more traditional archaeological project. It focused mostly on field reconnaissance. We were simply trying to find the sources and the conduits of this famous aqueduct, famous actually through some rather unusual channels, I suppose, in the sense that it was not well attested in Roman literature, but is famous to modern aqueduct hunters because they knew about its existence but didn't know where to find its sources. So the sources are really just being discovered in this new millennium. So what you see here are bits and pieces of the sources and conduits near the sources of the aqueduct, with the exception of the smaller image in the upper right. That is a completely separate water source, as it were. It's essentially a fumarole field, a bit like Yellowstone, perhaps, where this is not a hot spring. It's essentially just volcanic gases that are emerging up through spring water. But there are also thermal springs in the area. So this source region, which is around the lake called Bracciano, I'll show you a map in a minute, this source region has multiple types of water. And Adam, if you would, could you change the slide? Thanks. This gives you a sense of the layout of the ancient aqueducts of the city of Rome. Most of them, as you can see, came from the east, and they came from limestone karst landscapes. So the quality of the water coming in those aqueducts was rather different from the water coming from the northwest. And it's the one from the northwest that sort of wraps around Lake Bracciano, Sabatinus in antiquity, that has interested us. Now, the project is making a kind of right turn, as it were, and is becoming much more of an environmental history project. And so with this turn, we have posed new and larger questions, not just about the history of this aqueduct, but about the history of water consumption at Rome over the long term, essentially from, let's say, late prehistory, the Neolithic, up to our area of interest really extends up to the 17th or even the 18th century. All right, so we have two basic questions that we're posing as a consequence. The first one is, what long-term environmental effects did the Aqua Traiana impose upon the source region's local ecology and the populations inhabiting it? This is an aqueduct that was functioning for the better part of 600 or 700 years, but functioning in different ways and at different capacities. And so we're very curious to know whether the impounding of these waters for consumption in the great metropolis of Rome had positive or negative effects on the local region of the sources, which, as you can see, are up on the north and west side of Lake Bracciano. Our second question, an even broader question, is how did environmental conditions in the source region influence water use in Rome? And I would broaden that even further and say, not just in the source region, but in all of central Italy. In other words, we want to get good environmental profiles of this region, which then we can map onto what we know about the history of water consumption in the city of Rome to see if we can find interesting patterns and parallels. Next slide, please, Adam. So our first step has been to test the water chemistry of as many water sources in the region as we can, focusing on inorganic chemistry of the water, which is less changeable over time, as Cheryl could explain to you. But Tim Beach and Cheryl Lazatter Beach have assisted us with this component of the project. And we hope to continue with that over the next couple of seasons. Let's hope we have a season next year. We also now have some funding to begin lake coring. And this will have, I hope, implications, broad implications for the environmental history of the region, because it's not well documented at this stage at all. We have some published information from lake and mar cores in this region, but the lakes are very, very tricky to core. We think we've identified an excellent small lake to the north of Bracciano where we can take good long-term cores that could, at least theoretically, take us back maybe 20,000 years. So our main points of interest chronologically are not the Roman climatic optimum itself, but instead the period before and after. So particularly the era of the rise of Rome before about 200 BCE, and also late antiquity, when we know that that Rome begins to suffer periods of stress, environmental stress. Stress, of course, that's related simply to human conditions as well. But both, again, we may have interesting environmental conditions that map on top of the history of human events in the city. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Rabin. We're going to move from there a little bit closer to home and hear about the Maya region from Cheryl Lazatter Beach. And Cheryl, I will stop sharing and let you start sharing.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I will share my PowerPoint. Thank you. And hope that you all can see the word Mesoamerican water. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see so many people interested in research during the last week of classes. It's nice to think about what we've been doing in the past, in the field and in the labs, and to dream about the future, as Rabin said, hoping we can get back in the field sometime soon. I'm going to talk very briefly about the story of our studies of Mesoamerican water, looking specifically at ancient Maya wetland agriculture and some of the technologies that we're using to get at mapping the extent of this resource. This work has been ongoing for the beach labs since 1993 through the present. We've worked with Dr. Fred Valdez of our own UT Anthropology Department. He has been the director of the program for Belize Archaeology Project since 1992 moving forward. And then we're also collaborating with another wetland study across the coastal plain of Belize, led by Dr. Ellie Harrison Buck of the University of New Hampshire. And this is the Belize River East Archaeology Project that's been, again, running since about 2011. Our colleague here at UT, Astrid Ringaldier, is a co-PI on that project too. So we've been doing transects across the Belize coastal plain and up into the uplands, comparing and contrasting environments, and studying wetland agriculture and trying to determine the extent and the importance of these features. We had a publication in fall of 2019 led by Tim Beach and the rest of our crew in PNAS on mapping the wetlands of northwestern Belize and using Lidar and field checking to verify that these are actually ancient Maya fields after many decades of controversy about remote sensing and about the nature and the geomorphic origin of these things. So now we're extending the work to partner with other research projects that have similar wetland features in their backyards to try and, again, understand the extent of ancient Maya wetland farming, which is becoming more and more apparent as not just a boutique farming activity, but actually a sustainability, large-scale farming activity, and also representing resilience, because these wetlands, some of these wetland fields are in areas that are reclaimed ancient Maya farmland that was inundated by sea level rise and the rise of the groundwater table in these regions. So that's a lot to pack into one slide, but we're looking at the water resources of northwestern Belize here, and in between a number of different wetland and archaeologically demonstrated wetland agricultural sites. So our last field venture in Belize was June of 2019, working across both in the program for Belize and the Next Door Maya research program out of UT Tyler, but also collaborating with the BREA project at Crooked Tree with Sam Krause, who's one of our graduates, now teaches at Texas State, and Astrid doing wetland coring at the BREA site, extending our work further east in the Belize coastal plain. So here you see our teams out coring a wetland and also excavating a wetland. And then some of the surface exposure of the groundwater in those wetlands as well. A little bit of lab work has been ongoing. Sam Krause has been steadily working when she can get time in between her brand new job at Texas State and coming back here to work in our labs, which we're very grateful to the VP for Research for having a socially distanced plan for lab work. Otherwise, all of our graduate students would be going just stir crazy right now without anything to do because they can't get in the field, but we're very lucky that they can work time to time in the labs. And so Sam has been able to analyze some of those cores, and you can see some results from the Western Lagoon site near the BREA project. We've got some radiocarbon dates back, dating somewhere between 2200 and 4100 years BP. So we were really getting into some pre-classic, some very early time periods to bracket the dates of the existence of these wetland fields. As I said, we've continued monitoring water quality in the region, contrasting the environments from the Crooked Tree and the Belize Coastal Plains area to the Rio Bravo Conservation Management area to the uplands, because these water sources, although it's largely a karstic system, and I know Jay Banner has visited some of these resources as well, we find there's a pretty good contrast in terms of water quality across the system based on different spring sources and geologic contributions. So we continue to study the wetlands for their archaeological and agricultural value, but we also study the water for both drinking water and domestic purposes and for agricultural possibilities. So in addition to our field research, which we desperately want to get back to, we were able to do some outreach activities in 2019 and 2020. So along with Astrid and Ellie and Sam Krause and Tim Beach and other members of the team, we were able to do some outreach on wetlands education and a museum science fair in Crooked Tree, Belize. And here's a shot also of the Crooked Tree School, where there's a mural showing the importance of wetlands as sort of a central to the education theme here. Astrid and Ellie have worked very, very hard on helping to build up this museum, so we're really happy and proud for them and congratulate them on their their efforts with this educational outreach to kids and citizens and teachers, parents, you name it, the community of Crooked Tree, Belize. A second outreach activity we did that was also funded by PT 2050 in February of this year was Maya research outreach on Lidar, which is laser mapping. The gray scene you see in the upper right is a Lidar mapping of our wetland fields in Belize. You can read more of this in the October issue of PNAS 2019 about the mapping of these sites. We invited a number of scholars of Maya and Lidar studies to UT. We had international attendance. It was a wonderful workshop, having conversations about more collaboration rather than being independent little research units, to figure out how we can better collaborate, share data, to coordinate with UT, TACC, for instance, in terms of creating a secure Lidar data hub for people to collaborate together on these projects. So we have some exciting work that we've done in the past, and we're really looking forward to future collaborations when we can get back together with people. With COVID, it's good that we've got some digital stuff to work on until we can begin excavating again. So I'll turn this back to Adam and thank my, my co-authors, several of whom are in class teaching right now, so they can't be here. I see that Fred's here, and I'm really happy. And Angie's been a part of the Maya research as well, in addition to her work on the Romans and the Greeks. So we're just very fortunate to have a great team. Thanks all.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm going to take over the screen again.
There you go.
And one of the purposes of this project in bringing together these very disparate projects has been to create these connections where researchers are moving from site to site, and we're all working together to develop methods that are generalizable to help us understand bigger trends in the human past that aren't specific to a particular place or time. And that includes Texas, our own home state, and issues of water management in the much more recent past. And for that, I will turn things over to Michael Holleran. And Michael, just let me know when you want to advance slides.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I was going to say, apropos Jonathan's introduction, I'm here for the shallow past. This is part of a project, a book project that I am working on, which is a comparative study of the surface water systems of 5 Western US cities by the standards of an urban historian working from archival sources. This is deep past because it brings me back to the beginnings of colonial and beginnings of settlement in each of these places into the early 18th century in San Antonio and up to the future. I'm using primarily archival sources. I am looking at landscapes and looking at the material culture of ordinary urban life. So I am a keen consumer of archaeological data and your archaeological conclusions. Next slide, Adam. The acequias in San Antonio, as in each of these cities, as in urban settlements generally, primarily served and first served for agricultural production, which was far more integrated in the urban landscape early on, but also quite late in each of these places, well into the 20th century. You can see the full extent of the San Antonio acequia system. Not all of those channels existed simultaneously. That is about a 12-mile long map on a current satellite map. In an 1873 bird's eye view, you can pick out 2 of the acequias, which went everywhere in the urban fabric through the very center of the city. Next slide, please. And even, as you can see in the inset on the right, through the courtyard of what was then the fanciest hotel in late 19th century San Antonio, the Menger Hotel. As the city grew, as it got a modern pressurized water main system, the acequias remained as a redundant system, and that's really where I would say the heart of my work is, in the persistence of this redundant system and how the two different water systems co-evolved. Because the acequias were everywhere in the urban fabric, as the city grew and it had its modern water system, people were able to adapt the acequias to new uses, to urban uses. On the left, you can see the generating plant for the electric streetcar system, which uses steam-powered dynamos to generate electricity, cooled by the process water coming from the Alamo acequia. The acequias were also used for a cooling system for a city market, and I do not know the answer to how that worked, and I would love, I'm looking to figure that out. Some kind of passive swamp cooler system in the mid-19th century. They were, as a new sewer system was proposed, they were proposed as the source of flushing water for it, which in the end is not how San Antonio built it, but is how other cities did. Elsewhere, they were used to sprinkle streets for dust mitigation. They were used for fire suppression. And in San Antonio, as elsewhere, one of their most important uses in terms of how widespread was to support the urban cultural landscape. One of the acequias that had been physically discontinued was revived because its discontinuation hurt the trees in San Antonio parks. So the generalized conclusions that you all, that I look forward to talking to you all about across these times and places, was the importance of redundant systems, also of the decentralized knowledge and agency to be able to adapt them, and the conclusion that that really fostered resilience throughout the system by allowing people to pursue complex and changing objectives. All yours, Adam.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I've done a poor job of keeping us on time, but I do want to say a couple of words on the last piece of what we wanted to present, which is meant to try to pull together some of these threads and communicate it to an audience, in this case, an audience of students in the sort of high school and college frame. So one of our activities focused on the development of a teaching model that actually combined several parts of this work, specifically work on Roman aqueducts and work on Mesoamerican water supplies. We've been doing this with a Latin teacher at McCallum High School. There is a connection because a lot of the documents about the Spanish conquest are written in Latin, and some of them describe things like an aqueduct that fed Mexico City when it was Tenochtitlan. And so we worked on, with Zoe Thomas and Blaise Murphy, graduate students in classics and geography, the development of a teaching model that sort of asked students to design a Roman aqueduct at the site of Tikal, which has very interesting topography, and along the way explained how topography works. We're waiting for a video that Zoe made about this cake, which was a topographic cake meant to serve as an illustration of reading a topographical map. You can see the contour lines at intervals here that correspond to the layers of the cake itself, which I think is great. And we're hoping to deploy this in classrooms, probably virtual classrooms at McCallum in the spring, and see if we can expand that to other high school classes in the area to give students a sense of the challenges and creativeness of pre-modern societies in managing urban water and making sure that everybody had water. And we hope eventually to bring that home with some module material on the San Antonio Acequias, so that it becomes a really Texas-rooted thing and more meaningful to that audience who might not be receptive to the kinds of fairly abstruse things that we were talking about at the beginning of this presentation. Thank you all very much for your attention, and sorry for going over a bit.
Great, thanks, Adam. I think we should let Melissa and David go first, and then we can have Q&A all together after that.
Okay, wonderful.
And you can, if people want to, you can pose questions in the chat as well as throughout. I wanted to mention that.
Okay. So David and I are just going to present a subset of the Paleo Texas group project. And Paleo Texas broadly is interested in synthesizing 20,000 years of climate, ecological, and human settlement data across Central Texas. And we are motivated by the fact that Texas is projected to get warmer and drier in the future. And this is a primary concern with regards to how human populations and the ecosystems that human populations depend upon will be impacted by climatic changes like increased warmth and decreased precipitation. And we're already experiencing some of these negative impacts of climate change, including more intense storm activity and flooding, more droughts, and increased temperatures. And these climate changes are acting synergistically with other global change phenomena like habitat loss, invasive species, and disease. And all of these act together to decrease not only the overall well-being of human populations, but also biodiversity more broadly. Worldwide, we're losing species at an unprecedented rate, along with their ecosystem services, such as pest control and pollination. And researchers can and have made projections on how biodiversity will be impacted by climate change in the future. But we can also look to the past to give context for the present and the future. And specifically, we can look at how species, including humans, but also other members of ecological communities, responded to past climatic changes. And this can provide insight into both successful and unsuccessful strategies of adaptation to novel environmental conditions. So the overarching objective of the Paleo Texas group is to advance our understanding of how environmental change impacted biota and humans in Central Texas over periods that include abrupt warming, analogous to that for the 21st century. We are synthesizing existing archaeological, paleoecological, and paleoclimate data from across the Edwards Plateau. And we're also collecting new data, all of this with the goal of reconstructing climate, biodiversity, and human populations over the past 20,000 years. We're then analyzing the extent to which human settlements and biodiversity respond to climate. And today, my student David Ledesma and I are going to tell you about the paleoecological aspects of this work. And while it's only the two of us presenting, I will note that many others have contributed to this paleoecological work, including several graduate students, a postdoc, 8 undergraduates, and 3 high school students. So the research goals that we have with regards to the paleoecological data is to collate existing paleoecological records from across the state of Texas, to synthesize these paleoecological records with the archaeological and paleoclimate data, and also to understand how biodiversity responded to environmental changes over the last 20,000 years, using multiple lines of evidence, such as abundance data, morphological data, and genetic data. And for starters, it's important to note that Texas looked very different 20,000 years ago. Here is a figure from a recent study that used an innovative technique of ancient DNA to get a sense of ancient biodiversity from one particular locality in Central Texas. And this is really just a sampling of what we had in the past. There are some animals like pocket mice and cottontail rabbit that are still present on the landscape today, but there are many species, particularly the mammalian megafauna, that are extinct, like the saber-toothed cat and the short-faced bear. The megafauna have received a lot of attention historically with regards to a previous paleontological study, and there are other research groups currently working on the non-volant small mammal populations. Over the past year, our group has really been focused on acquiring new data on a subset of species that haven't been well studied previously. And we're studying Herpetofauna, which includes reptiles and amphibians, as well as bats. These organisms play a crucial role in ecosystems today worldwide. They're indicators of ecosystem health. They're also agents of pest control. Bats perform really important pollination services. And worldwide, a large percentage of reptiles, amphibians, and bats are threatened with extinction due to the confluence of global change factors, including climate change. So from a conservation perspective, it's important to understand how they'll respond to climate change in the future and what they responded, how they responded in the past. So now I'll pass it over to David, who will tell you more about the methods of inquiry that we use and his research on the fossil reptiles and amphibians.
All right. So as Melissa mentioned, a lot of our research focuses on looking at paleoecology of Texas. And right here is some significant paleoecological sites across Texas. Our work so thus far has focused mainly on sites in the Edwards Plateau, which is this uplifted region in central Texas. And this region in Texas is significant because there's a lot of karst features, and these karst features, including caves, are really good at preserving fossil remains. And so these features are what allows us to understand these organisms that lived in Texas in the past in the lake quaternary. And specifically, we're looking at sites that encompass the last 20,000 years. Next slide, please. And so COVID has kind of allowed us to pursue some avenues that we wouldn't have otherwise pursued since we haven't been able to get into the lab as much. And so one thing that we have been doing is looking back at the published paleontological literature in Texas. And so a lot of that literature has these faunal lists, which is basically a list of all the fossil taxa that have been found at a particular paleontological site. And so what we've been doing, and we've gotten some help with some undergrads in doing this, is digitizing some of these faunal lists into these digital spreadsheets, which allows us to look at all these different paleontological sites, understand how old different sites are, and what taxa are found at each site. And so this is very useful information for understanding how different organisms were distributed across the landscape and how they change through time in response to different environmental changes through time as well. Next slide, please. And so one site that we've been focusing on in particular is this site called Hall's Cave, which is also located on Edwards Plateau. It's about 3 hours west of Austin. So this cave is a really world-renowned famous cave. Today, the area outside the cave is this open shrubland, open woodland habitat. You can see the opening of the cave in figure D right there. It's a kind of a sinkhole. And the cave itself is not very big. You can see in the schematic diagram on the figure on the right how big the cave is relative to a person. But this cave has been really important for understanding the responses of different fauna in Texas throughout the late Pleistocene. Next slide, please. And so Hall's Cave is so famous and so rich with data because it has a relatively continuous stratigraphic sequence spanning the last 20,000 plus years. There's an abundant amount of fossil material from the cave itself. And there's 23 published radiocarbon dates throughout the cave sequence, which allows us to relatively date all the fossil fauna that we find within the cave at a pretty incredible time resolution. In addition, there's previous paleoclimate reconstructions that have been based directly on data from Hall's Cave, as well as paleoclimate reconstructions from nearby Texas localities. And this allows us to get some context about what the climate was like at the time that these fossils were being deposited, at the time that these organisms were living on the Texas landscape. Next slide, please. And so in our research thus far, some techniques that we've used have been digital techniques for these paleoecological data. In the figure on the left, we have a fossil bat mandible. And one of the grad students in our lab, Molly Morose, has used a technique called geometric morphometrics, where you place landmarks on different parts of the bones to try to understand morphological change through time and try to see if that morphological change is correlated with these environmental changes through time as well. The video on the right, I don't know if it's gonna play, oh it does, shows a fossil salamander vertebra that I created a 3D model of using a technique called photogrammetry. And so with this technique, I can obtain a fossil, I can create a 3D model of any fossil that I've found from the Hall's Cave sequence and create a morphological record of that fossil. So this fossil is an example of a fossil that we might want to sample for ancient DNA analysis further on. However, having a record of the morphological features of this fossil is important to combine both genetic data and morphological data to get a better understanding of how these two data sets can inform on how these organisms have changed through time and answer other questions about how the environment has led to these responses over the last 20,000 years. Next slide, please. And so a lot of our work thus far, especially for me, has been sorting and identifying fossil material from different paleoecological sites. In the picture on the left, you can see fossil matrix from Hall's Cave. The finger is pointing to a small snake vertebra fossil. And in the picture on the right, we've used some of this material for outreach events to try to show different high school students in these outreach events how we sort and identify fossils and how this is important for understanding how these different organisms responded to environmental changes in the past. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to talk about some of my preliminary results from sorting and identifying these fossils. In the pictures at the top, I have selected some fossils from frogs, snakes, and lizards to give you an idea of what some of these fossils look like. Next slide, please. And so specifically, my research focuses on the Herpetofauna, and I'm specifically focused on the lizards and the salamanders from Hall's Cave. So from Hall's Cave, the mammalian fauna has been the main interest of researchers thus far, and the Herpetofauna, including these reptiles and amphibians, hasn't been looked at in much detail. So previously, there has been a non-apomorphy-based approach to these fossil identifications, and limited to no fossil descriptions were given when these different fossils were identified. And this is not ideal. If you don't know what an apomorphy is, it's an evolutionary derived feature which gives strong evidence for a fossil being identified to the taxon that it was. And so part of my work has been going back and looking at all these fossils and seeing whether I can use apomorphies to provide strong evidence that these fossils were identified at the correct taxonomic level. And so what I've found thus far is that even though some of these taxa have been identified at a species or genus level, using an apomorphy-based approach, apomorphies can only give you strong confidence in your identifications at maybe the family level or a subfamily level. Next slide, please. However, using apomorphies, I've also been able to add taxa that were not previously described from Hall's Cave, and these include Urosaurus, a genus of tree lizards, Teiids or whip-tailed lizards, and skinkids or different skinks that we have in Texas today as well. Next slide, please. And so in addition to my preliminary identifications of fossils using apomorphies, I've also tallied the maximum number of individuals for 4 broad groups of Herpetofauna, including lizards, snakes, salamanders, and frogs within the 5 centimeter intervals that Hall's Cave was excavated at. Next slide, please. And so this graph is showing you the relative abundance of these different Herpetofauna groups over the past 12,000 years. So these relative abundance represent the relative number of fossils for each group over the total number of fossils for all groups within that stratigraphic 5 centimeter interval. And so what you can see from this graph is that there's significant changes in the relative abundance of different Herpetofauna groups. Specifically, you can see that 12,000 years ago, there was a significantly higher relative abundance of frogs compared to more recently, with another peak in relative abundance of frogs at about 6,000 years ago. What you might also notice is that salamanders in Hall's Cave were extirpated at about 6,000 years ago. And salamanders today in the Kerr County area where Hall's Cave is located are not found today. All right, next slide, please. And so we can compare these relative abundances for different Herpetofauna groups with different paleoclimate interpretations. And so these are different proxies for paleoclimate taken directly from Hall's Cave or nearby Texas localities on the Edwards Plateau. You can see that we have delta carbon-13 paleoclimate proxies, faunal proxies for different paleoclimate predictions, sedimentation proxies, and proxies based on magnetic susceptibility. And so these proxies are in somewhat disagreement at the very fine time scales, but generally what we can infer is that there's relatively wetter and cooler conditions back in the end of the Pleistocene at about 12,000 years, and generally warmer, dry conditions closer to the present in the Holocene. All right, next slide, please. Now, if we look at paleoclimate predictions based on generalized atmospheric circulation models, we can get an estimate of precipitation and temperature over the past 12,000 years. And what we can see is that 12,000 years ago, again, you can see that precipitation was much higher in this region of Texas. And as precipitation goes down from 12,000 years ago to 7,500 years ago, you can also see that the relative abundance of frogs also decreases. And this coincides with a relative increase in temperature at the end of the Pleistocene into the Holocene at about 11,000 years ago. And so this makes sense for frogs, since frogs and amphibians in general would require environments with high amounts of moisture, since they need to keep their skin moist to survive, to exchange oxygen with the environment and carry out these different processes like breeding in aquatic environments as well. And so these preliminary data show that these changes in Herpetofauna abundances, fossil Herpetofauna abundances from Hall's Cave may very well correspond to these larger changes in climate that we're seeing during these 1,000-year timescales. All right, next slide, please. And so I've also looked at lizard diversity through time specifically. And what I've also noticed is that 12,000 years ago, you have higher diversity of lizards compared to more recently. So at the family level, 12,000 years ago, you have anguids, crotophytids, phrynosomatids, skinks, and Teiid lizards, whereas closer to present, you may only have phrynosomatids, anguids, and Teiids being present on the landscape. And so the landscape around Hall's Cave has changed significantly through time. And we know based on pollen records that the vegetation has changed as well in response to changes in climate. further analysis, I suspect, at lower taxonomic resolution will reveal how these different lizards have changed in diversity through time, and how maybe different climate regimes and different vegetation landscapes may also be correlated with these changes in diversity as well. All right, and I think that's the last slide for me.
Okay, so I will tell you a bit about the bat research that was completed by Molly Moros, who is a master's student in my lab. She graduated this past spring, and her research centered on 2 species of bats that were both present in central Texas, the cave Myotis, Myotis velifer, and the big brown bat, Aptesicus fuscus. Both species had been studied previously to some extent. It's worth noting that today Myotis velifer is much more range restricted than Aptesicus fuscus is. But interestingly, Myotis velifer is still present in central Texas today, whereas Aptesicus fuscus was extirpated about 2,500 years ago. So Molly was interested in knowing what, if any, morphological changes these species may have undergone over the past 20,000 years, and if these changes corresponded to climatic changes. And morphology is one factor about these bats that had not been studied previously. There is good reasoning to think that there may be morphological changes associated with changing climate in these species. Both in their present ranges today display morphological variation that's linked to temperature and precipitation gradients. And more broadly, mammals have been observed to be larger in colder climates, a phenomenon that's known as Bergmann's rule. So Molly sampled bats from 4 caves on the Edwards Plateau, including Hall's Cave that David talked about. And she used geometric morphometrics to quantify shape and size for each bat mandible that was present. And what she found is that both species become smaller over time, but interestingly, there's no link between, or at least not a clear relationship between size and temperature alone. And this meant that we found no support for Bergmann's rule as it is traditionally formulated, and our study was the first to test for Bergmann's rule in the fossil record of bats. However, she did find that both species were larger in drier environments than they are in wetter environments. And with regards to shape, only Myotis velifer exhibited shape variation across temperature and precipitation regimes. And we can delve into that shape variation a little bit more, and it was associated with a few parts of the mandible, the coronoid process, the condylar process, and the mandibular synthysis. And these parts all play a pivotal role in bite force. So changes in these features might relate to changes in diet, in particular, the hardness of insect prey that's available to these bats during different climate regimes. So we're hoping to follow up on this work with a multitude of other analyses, including stable isotope analyses that might provide more insight into diet and vegetation changes. In some ways with this project, we found some really interesting results, but we're also left with more questions than answers at this point. But one thing that is abundantly clear from the data that we have is that these 2 species exhibit different responses to environmental changes, and they have different outcomes. So the morphological variation exhibited by Myotis velifer may have allowed it to persist in central Texas, whereas Aptesicus fuscus, which is extirpated, may have responded simply by leaving central Texas. And that is informed by the fact that with modern ecological studies of Aptesicus fuscus, we've seen that it will only use caves during cold periods. So as central Texas became warmer over the Quaternary, it may have left the region altogether, which is also a viable and resilient response to climate change, equally as viable as adapting your morphology. So we're hoping to query these responses and try to test these hypotheses using other lines of evidence, such as ancient DNA, which will allow us to look at genetic diversity through time and the connectivity of populations in central Texas to other parts of the country. So in terms of future directions, we're continuing to collect novel paleoecological data through this process of sorting and identifying specimens, and working with our other PaleoTexas team members to synthesize these data with archaeological and paleoclimate data to identify synergies and gaps in our records. David has really been at the forefront of identifying these Herpetofauna from Hall's Cave over the past 20,000 years, trying to get to the lowest taxonomic resolution possible, using both morphology, and we will also start using ancient DNA to try doing that soon. We've been a little bit delayed with COVID in terms of getting into the lab, but hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to start that really exciting lab work. And then we will also be tracking morphological changes in a similar fashion to what we've done with bats in the Herpetofauna from Hall's Cave. and doing ancient DNA analyses, as I mentioned, for the Herpetofauna, but also for the bats. And quickly just want to thank everyone that's part of this Paleo Texas team. We span multiple colleges and disciplines across the university. It's been a really fun group to work with, as well as the members of my lab who have contributed to this project. And I think that's it in terms of what I have to share.
Great, thank you. So we just had so much info to cover there, but thanks y'all for sticking around. Wonder if there's any questions for anybody or for each other.
I have one question. I hope it's not too out of left field, but I was curious. I'm Dave Kramer, the program director for Planet Texas 2050. I'm just curious about the challenges you face in the field, particularly on the border of Belize and Guatemala. If you have to go through certain channels, or how you do that. I'm just familiar with the region and know that it's. I've been there several times, but know that it's a disputed border. It's not a big, armed conflict or anything like that going on. But I wonder if it presents extra hurdles. Just curious how you get the work done.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for the question. Well, as just individuals, we're able to move pretty easily across the border between Guatemala and Belize. We typically take the bus or take a puddle hopper local airplane to Flores. And so we've been able to make our exchanges and, ditch the rental car at the Eastern Belizean archaeology project from San Antonio, for instance, and take the bus. The major difficulty is really moving rental cars and those kinds of things. We had difficulty between Belize and Mexico about 30 years ago, 20 years ago, for instance. So that's not too difficult. There seems to be less and less really tension or dispute between the governments on that border, but there's certainly a lot of illicit activity taking place through that border and through those corridors that we have to be careful of. So, we get to swoop in and do field research for 1 to 3 months a year there and then leave. But, people have to endure incursions, not so much anymore, but there's a drug trafficking corridor. There's human trafficking corridor through Central America, and the coast is not immune to these kinds of movements too. So there are some sensitivities for sure. The other sensitivities are with remote sensing, and especially with our Lidar work. And so we had to coordinate very carefully with the Belizean air authorities and their version of Homeland Security, and with the Institute of Archaeology through the auspices of Fred Valdez and Tom Guterjohn, his counterpart at UT Tyler. So we had to get permissions to fly anything. I mean, if you show up at the Belize airport with a drone, it's probably going to get confiscated. So you really need permission. There's a film commission that you need permission to go make movies and so forth. So those are the sensitivities. And then the remote sensing itself, the sensitivities are twofold. One is your Lidar is going to show both ancient and modern buildings. So first of all, you're taking pictures of people's backyards. And so you really need to be careful about people's privacy and what you may inadvertently be exposing with any kind of remote sensing or photography. The other thing is you may be showing, illegal airstrips where drug planes land, for instance. So you really need to just, be aware of your surroundings in terms of what you're researching and writing about. The other major sensitivity is exposing archaeological cultural patrimony to looting, and showing people a treasure map to X marks the spot for monuments and other archaeological buildings. So those are part of the sensitivities and the considerations for forming, say, a mile Lidar data sharing hub or any kind of remote sensing data sharing hub. It's sort of like medical data, because this is about people's lives, not just the past, but it's also about protecting cultural resources and natural resources. So great question, Dave. Thanks so much. And I hope we all get back to Belize sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
I also have a question for our presenters, or anyone else really. I know there's a lot of people on here who, think about the past as part of their professional lives. And I was wondering, I guess, how thinking about the past, whether it be in scales of millennia or decades, how that influences you from a disposition. Like how do you see life and society, like, and how do you incorporate like a vision of the past or feel of the past into like how you see the world, and in what ways is that valuable, and how can could such a disposition be beneficial to more people, I guess?
I can jump in on that, just with two things. I mean, there are as many ways, I imagine, to incorporate this long view into your life as there are different people. But I think that the two things that jump out at me are the range of creativity and creative solutions that have allowed human beings to survive over time. So, I mean, we are entering a mess very much of our own making. And it may be quite unpleasant and not necessarily a situation that everyone can survive, but I suspect that there will be a lot of unexpected solutions. And I think that one of those issues of perspective is being open to different kinds of solutions, right? We think of things increasingly in very black and white terms, right? We're going to have a cool tech solution and it's going to solve all the problems and we don't have to change anything that we do, because we're in a very spoiled moment in time, at least those of us in the Western first world. And I think that looking back over the past allows you to gain a little perspective about the ability of people to change what they're doing, and to cope with the loss of ways of life that disappear. And the other thing that I constantly think about is the randomness of the patterning of human activity, right? So archaeologists like to think that you can look at things that happened in the past and reconstruct them on the basis of where things are left, the patterning of material objects. But if you apply that to your own life, that is, rather than looking at the present from the perspective of the past, looking at the present from the perspective of the distant future, you realize just how random and inexplicable many of your acts are and how uninterpretable they would be to the future. So it sort of helps to have that sense of caution about, randomness when you look at the contents of your kitchen cabinet. And I work on ancient food, among other things. And one of the ways that we look at food is through the lens of culture. And some of the stuff that we're doing at Histria, especially in terms of aDNA analysis of the oral microbiome that's preserved in dental calculus, is trying to see if there are correlations between other cultural signs and the microbiome signatures in people's dental calculus. Because those things are correlated, diet and your oral microbiome. So we are assuming that we can make those identifications and we'll be able to say something about identity. But I think it was the New York Times that had a little game a few weeks ago where it asked you to identify the political orientation of an anonymous person on the basis of the contents of their refrigerator, right? Is this person, on the basis of the refrigerator contents, a Trump voter or a Biden voter? And I tried it and it was completely wrong. And apparently it's completely wrong for everybody. So we think that we should be able to say, like, your refrigerator is full of, Campbell's soup cans and mac and cheese, and so you must be a Trump voter. And this other refrigerator is full of artisanal yogurt, and this person must be a Biden voter. But it is not at all that simple. So it gives you some perspective on the complexity of a human identity and character.
Jonathan, I love your question because a lot of my students are city and regional planners who are future oriented and action oriented. So I think about this, and I would echo what Adam said, which I'll interpret as a certain humility. I think an awareness of the unfoldingness of change, the contingency and unfoldingness, and the fact that how things are changing is not immediately evident. And then the companion to that is the question, as an historian trying to understand how to interpret evidence, as everyone in this conversation is trying to figure out how to find and interpret evidence, but putting yourself into the contemporary place to try to understand what evidence was available, what evidence do we have now as to what the heck is going on. That seems particularly salient these days, since we've exploded epistemology, but you know, we all have to act in the world, and we have to try and understand the world. And my thoughts.
Maybe I'll pipe in on Adam's comment about randomness, which I find fascinating and I think a lot about, because if you're brought up and steeped in sort of systems theory, you love the power of feedbacks, right? And this sort of invisible hand and all of the strength, but also, you know, I mean, there's so many good examples. I think of the writings of Asamoah, you know, who really emphasizes the sort of serendipitous nature, like, you know, sort of modern democracy didn't happen because it was the inevitable outcome. It was often incredibly lucky and, you know, balanced on a knife edge going either way. So I think that's very interesting, and it's this constant tension there in at least in my thinking about sort of the forces that kind of generate organization in, say, ecosystems or whatever, and then the kind of randomness and you know, the effect of extreme events and other things on outcomes. Anyway, I thought it was an interesting insight, thinking from the historical perspective.
Well, I got to speak about Belize earlier, but I'll jump in this little silent lull, and just the opportunity to observe all these parallel past complex societies and see human ingenuity around the globe, I think is really compelling for me to think about how people solve problems, how they use a common language of mathematics and physics, for instance, to solve water problems, how the Maya could conceive of numbers larger than their own history, that people are resilient and they are able to rise to challenges. And so it gives us hope that we can do the same. Here we sit in a global pandemic, and we're really hoping that science can come up with a cure, if you will, for the disease. But we have to look at it also through social science to understand human behavior, and to show how people can learn to mitigate behavior that will also help keep disease down. So it's like it's a partnership between different fields that helps us to solve problems, both science and social science and humanities, to come together in terms of our behavior, our culture, and our science. So I'll leave it at that.
I feel like that defines the bridging barriers and grand challenges in a nutshell. Thank you. It's really good.
Would anyone else like to contribute? Give it a minute, give it a beat. Well, thanks everyone. Oh, Adam, yeah.
Sorry, I just realized something, and it's not about sort of profound insights, but I was having a side chat with Melissa because I didn't realize that her lab was using photogrammetry, and this is something that we've been using a lot in archaeology as well, and something that we have actually set up a sort of remote workflow for on TAC with a particular software platform. And if we hadn't had this presentation, despite the fact that Melissa and I are working together on 3 different projects, I don't know that I would have made that connection. So having these opportunities to share, even with people who are already involved in the same projects, you always learn something new and find these new possibilities for collaboration and pooling of resources that I think is the thing that makes being at UT and part of this program so exciting.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks to everyone. Yeah, I really like those responses, like not so much that we need to adopt specifically what people have done at certain points in time, but just the fact that there has been such a range of response and solution finding is like what the key takeaway for like building our like our imaginations and our like political wills going forward. So I appreciate that, and thanks so much for everyone who attended, and yeah, stay in touch and stay tuned. We have 3 more of these, one tomorrow, and then one next Tuesday and the following Wednesday. So thanks a lot, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for organizing.